So I want to start by talking about how much and what people eat. Then I'm going to talk about the experience of pain and physical health, and that will include a little stuff about pet ownership. And then finally, I'm going to talk about attraction and love. So how do attraction and love influence physical responses in a variety of ways? So I also want to say at the outset that I am glad to send a copy of this entire presentation to anybody at the end. So if you have questions about the research I discussed, I'm glad to send cites or the papers that I'm citing, the direct paper, and just be in touch if you have any questions. So I teach classes in health, psychology, and in close relationships. So a lot of this is material that I've used in my classes. I also teach intro to psychology and social psychology and sports psychology. So if you have questions about any of those and you teach similar things, let me know. So I want to start by talking about how thoughts impact eating, and in particular, how thoughts influence eating in terms of the mood that we're in. And we can all probably think about times in which we've eaten for reasons that we are not hungry, but instead we're eating based on mood, based on feelings, et cetera, the situation we're in. So one of the most common is, of course, eating to feel better, so to make yourself feel better if you're depressed. And this cartoon speaks to this, I think, well. And so the person saying, I'm not eating, I'm self-medicating, and we think about that in terms of women eating ice cream in particular. People eat out of boredom, so sitting around sort of mindlessly eating potato chips and watching TV or something. And again, this cartoon is one my students like, so I really shouldn't have any dessert. My trainer tells me never to eat out of boredom. We also eat in our society out of celebration. So people eat to celebrate at weddings, at graduations, Thanksgiving, holidays, things like that. So those are just simple examples of how mood influences our eating behavior in lots of different ways. We also know that the appearance of food, so again, this is something about the physical appearance of food, not our internal hunger or need to eat out of hunger, but the appearance of food can influence our feelings of hunger and our eating in a variety of ways. So some very clever research. A lot of this research was done by Brian Wansink at Cornell, has done really interesting research that on this topic of food and eating, and I'm going to talk about a few examples. So first of all, he did a study a few years ago that he described as the endless bowl of soup. So people came into the lab, and they were told you can eat as much soup as you want, and you're going to rate the soup, and just stop eating when you feel full. But the conditions varied. So in one condition, people ate soup in a normal bowl, and when they were finished, they just asked for another bowl, and the researcher brought over another bowl, et cetera. In the other condition, they actually had created a very clever soup bowl design in which there was a bowl on the table, but they had a giant vat of soup underneath the table that was being constantly piped in to fill the bowl. So every time somebody took a bite of the soup, the underneath that replenished so that you could never make any progress, so that every time you took a bite, more soup came into your bowl from underneath the table through this little tube. And they simply measured how much did people eat in those two conditions. So in both conditions, they're told you can eat as much as you want, but in one condition, you actually had an awareness of how much you were eating because you had to ask for a second bowl and a third bowl and so on. And then the other condition, of course, you had no idea how much you were eating. And as you might expect, people who were eating the endless bowl of soup that they never had to actually ask for another bowl ate significantly more than people who had the cue of, oh, I finished one bowl, I finished a second bowl, I finished a third bowl. So if we're not really aware of how much we're eating, it tends to lead us to eat more. Another study, again, this is by Brian Wansink, looked at the impact of the size of the portions. So he did, and he's done a number of studies that have looked at this in different ways, but in particular, he did one study that was actually looking at the size of popcorn buckets. And students came in, they were told they're going to watch a movie, and they're going to get popcorn to eat, and he looked at how much popcorn people consumed simply as a function of whether they had a small, medium, or large container. All of the containers you could get as much as you wanted, so it's not like the large container you could have more. You just could have more without going and asking for another one. And what he found was that people who were given the larger bowl of popcorn ate significantly more popcorn than people who had the smaller bowl. What was particularly interesting to me about this study was he actually did another variation of it when he took popcorn that was old. So it was old, it was stale, it was not, hot, delicious, fresh movie popcorn, and he still found the same effect. So even if you're eating old popcorn, stale popcorn, not particularly delicious popcorn, you still eat more if it's in this large container. So the two studies I've talked about so far look at how the portion size and the appearance of that portion influences eating and can lead you to eat more than perhaps you might want. But other research has shown that in some cases, the appearance of food can actually lead to the opposite. So research has been done looking at the shape of brownies, and in particular, whether you can have cues to the shape of brownies that indicate that people should eat less of those. So in one study done by Paul Rosen at Penn, he told students to come into the lab hungry. So they actually, arrived feeling hungry. And as they walked into the lab, there was the smell of delicious brownies baking. So you walked in, and this delicious chocolate odor filled the air. And these were hungry students, so they were excited. This is great. I'm going to get to eat brownies. And then when he pulled the brownies out of the oven, which he did in front of the students so they could, see that these were actual brownies coming out of an actual oven that they'd already smelled. But the brownies in this study were in the shape of dog poop. So they were actually brownies. They were fresh. They were good. They smelled like brownies, etc. But they were in the shape of dog poop. So it, again, is sort of a cue visually that we're not supposed to eat things that look like that. And what he saw in this study very clearly was that people, even when they were hungry, even when this was the delicious smell of brownies, actually had trouble eating the brownies because of this, visual cue that, wait, this is really not food, and I should not be eating this. So those are examples of how the appearance of food impacts eating. But I now want to turn to look at how the setting influences eating, because we also eat differently based on the situation that we're in. Research has shown that people in large groups eat more than people in small groups. That might be in part because we tend to take longer to eat when we're in a large group, so people linger. There may be more conversation. It may be more social. It may be more celebratory. So it might be that the large group effect is really driven by the time that it takes to eat. We also know that people, however, eat less when they're eating in a fancy setting. So when you have a tablecloth, when you have candles, when you have nice china, people actually are more conscious of what they're eating, and they tend to eat less food. One set of studies actually did this by creating a fancy setting in a fast food restaurant. So they literally had people come into a fast food restaurant, and they had set up the restaurant in half of the conditions, the same food, but they had installed tablecloths, candles, mood, music, etc., dimmed the lights, so it had sort of a fancier feel. And it didn't change what people ordered, so people's ordering was the same, but people consumed fewer calories when they were in this nicer kind of a setting. So simply sort of dressing up the environment seems to influence eating. We also know that cues to particular food can matter. So being in a restaurant and having the waiter or waitress bring over a dessert menu, or even better, a dessert tray, is a very major cue to foods. People can all of a sudden feel they'd like to eat something because they walk by a store and it smells really good, or they walk by a bakery and the appearance of the food looks very appealing as well. And here's a cartoon that illustrates this that I use in my health psychology class. So the bear thing, I shouldn't, but I'm going to have the garbage. So when you read about it, when you see things that look appealing, you're more likely to eat and more likely to overeat in that way. So thus far, I've talked largely about things that lead us to eat more than we'd want to eat, whether that's the appearance of food or the portion size or the setting. But we also know that another thing that has a big impact on food in a different way is a function of the person that we're eating with, so the eating partners. And this is particularly true for women. And a number of studies have shown that women who are eating in the presence of a desirable dating partner tend to eat less than women who are eating in the presence of a less desirable dating partner. So one study that I talk about with my students in terms of self-presentation of eating looked at researchers ask students to come in and have a get-to-know-you conversation, so a casual get-to-know-you conversation with another student. These were all female students. And they were told they were going to be interacting with another student who was male. And in one condition, the student they were interacting with was described in very desirable ways. So he was captain of the football team, he was a straight-A student, he was going to law school, he was the editor of the student newspaper, sort of had all of these, was interested in travel and photography, and so really seemed like a very desirable dating partner in a number of different ways. In the other condition, the students were told they were going to be interacting with somebody who was described as had tried out for the football team and been cut, proofread for the student newspaper, had straight C's, and had a career interest of making money, and a television watching was his only hobby. So somebody who was significantly less appealing in terms of a dating partner. And what they found in this study was that women who were talking to the desirable dating partners ate many, many fewer, in this case M&Ms, than women who were talking to the non-desirable dating partners. So the researcher simply told them to have a get-to-know-you conversation and then left a bowl of M&Ms on the table between them and said, oh, by the way, these were left over from a psychology department party last night, help yourself. And so it was a very, subtle kind of dependent variable, just how many M&Ms the women ate, but they found a highly significant effect of whether you were eating with a desirable versus non-desirable dating partner, that women ate less when they wanted to attract potentially the desirable dating partner, in line with women using under-eating as a cue to femininity and attractiveness. And that goes along with sort of what we think about in society about women, not eating very much in the presence of men, that they, will only eat a salad, they're not very hungry, etc. Now, this has major implications, and I now want to talk about some research that I've done and some research that other people have done looking at why this is really problematic on a broader level in terms of women under-eating in the presence of desirable dating partners. So we've been interested in examining why this happens. Why do you get this effect of under-eating in the presence of desirable dating partners? And one clear issue is that the salience of the thinness norm for women leads women to believe they need to present as not hungry, as being thin, in order to appear attractive and appear feminine. This is an actual photo of a runway model that I think sort of illustrates the extremity in terms of thinness, that this woman is obviously at an unhealthy weight, and yet is being portrayed as a feminine ideal of beauty, although she's clearly not healthy. We know from lots of research that there's a major misperception of weight-related norms in our culture, and in particular that women believe other women are thinner than they actually are, and that women are concerned with being thinner than they really should be. So one study that looked at this asked high school girls who were readers of 17 magazine to rate what they would ideally like to be in terms of both height and weight, so to give their ideal height and their ideal weight. And what they found was that women's ideal height was 5'7", which is, of course, 3 or 4 inches taller than the average woman. But even more problematically, the weight they wanted to go with this 5'7" height was 100 pounds. And if you do the BMI calculation of a woman who weighs 100 pounds and is 5'7", that woman meets the diagnostic criteria of anorexia nervosa. So it's extremely problematic that the body ideal of these high school girls is, in fact, a weight that's unhealthy and disordered. My own research has examined something similar, which is that I've done studies in which we ask women at the start of their freshman year in college, how much do you weigh and how much do you think other women weigh? And what we find is that if you cross it over for height, women weigh on average around 130 pounds, and they assume that other women weigh around 130 pounds. Then if you go back to the women 6 months later, so the start of their spring semester, and you say, how much do you weigh? Women on average gain some weight during their first semester at college. And so women at this point say they weigh around 135 pounds. So they have, in fact, gained about 5 pounds on average. But the really interesting and sad part of this is that if you then ask women, how much do other women weigh? And these are women in a residential college. So they eat with these other women, they exercise with them, they shower with them, they share rooms with them, they see them with great frequency. They should be aware that their own weight is increasing, and so, gosh, probably other women's weight is increasing as well. But what you see if you go back to these women 6 months later, they've gained around 5 pounds, but they believe that other women have actually lost weight. So women now weigh around 135 pounds, but if you ask them how much do other women weigh, they say, oh, around 125 pounds. So that's obviously really problematic that they start college and believe they're sort of at the norm in terms of weight, but if you go 6 months later, they in fact think they are about 10 pounds heavier on average than other women. And most importantly, if you look at the gap between women's own weight and their perception of other women's weight, the bigger that gap is, the more signs you see of disordered eating. So the more signs you see of binging and purging, et cetera. So it's really problematic to have those perceptions. So one study that I think illustrated the extent to which this weight-related pressure and the thinness norm impacts behavior was done by Paul Rosen at Penn, and what he did was ask women, how embarrassed would you be if you had to walk into a drugstore and buy one of the following products? And the products were condoms, Snickers bar, pregnancy test, and Tampax. And overwhelmingly, college women wrote that the most embarrassing of these products to buy would be a Snickers. So that just strikes me as, extremely sad that women feel comfortable, saying I'm having sex, I'm having unprotected sex, but, they certainly can't say that if they like chocolate. That would be, embarrassing and awkward. So I now want to turn to the next part of my talk, which is how do thoughts influence pain and physical health and physical well-being. So we've all heard, of course, about the placebo effect, and there is strong evidence that, in fact, giving people a medication that they believe is a name brand, so, Advil or Tylenol versus, the CVS or Walgreens brand, in fact, leads to better recovery. So, headache goes away, cold symptoms, seem to decrease, et cetera. But that's purely because people have this belief that having a name brand drug means it's going to be more effective. There's no actual difference in the pharmacological properties of the drug, but if people believe it's more effective, of course, that belief can and does have an impact on physical health. So that's just a very subtle example of how our perceptions of what we're taking can influence health. Even more remarkably, though, is a study that was done a number of years ago actually examined the effectiveness of placebo surgery. So what they did in this study, and it was done with full approval of the ethics and an informed consent, et cetera, but they looked at men who were being seen at a veterans hospital because they had knee trouble, and the men were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So one group of men actually got arthroscopic knee surgery, as is commonly done. Another group of the men were assigned to have a variation of that surgery in which the surgeon cut open the kneecap and sort of scraped around at some cartilage, but then sewed it back up. And the third set of men, actually, they simply cut the knee open, sewed the knee back up, and that was it. There was absolutely nothing done in terms of the impact of the surgery, in terms of doing any actual procedures. They basically just created a scar. And then they looked at the men's recovery. So researchers who were blind to which condition the men were in rated how well they recovered, how much pain medication they needed, how quickly they got discharged from the hospital, walking, recovery, the patient's reports of knee pain, et cetera. And the remarkable thing about this study is they actually found no differences. So the men who were in all three of those conditions actually had the same recovery, suggesting that just the belief that you've had surgery and that because I've had surgery things are going to get better actually leads to improvement, lower levels of pain, and better recovery in terms of knee function. So the placebo effect in terms of how our thoughts influence pain may extend, in fact, much further than we had even believed. We also know that simply faking or presenting in a positive way can influence the experience of pain. So in one very clever study, they had women come into the study, women and men, but I'm showing pictures of women, come in to do a research study, and they were randomly assigned to hold chopsticks in their teeth. And these are actually the experimental pictures from the participants. And in one condition, they were told to hold a neutral expression. In another condition, they were told to hold a mild smile. And in the third condition, they were told to have a genuine smile. And you can see in that picture on the far right, the woman's eyebrows are involved in her nose, and she's sort of squinching up her whole face in a genuine smile. So they held the chopsticks in their teeth in one of those three, using one of those three facial expressions, and then they performed a mildly painful task. So putting their hand in a bucket of cold ice water, which is an unpleasant task, but not unbearable. And what they found was that women who were holding the genuine smile rated the ice water as less painful and were actually able to hold their hand in the water for a longer period of time. So this suggests that, again, the power of simply holding your face in a certain expression can improve your ability to tolerate pain and to, in fact, see things as less painful. Again, subtle ways that our body postures, facial expressions, et cetera, can influence the pain we feel. We also know that simply looking at nature scenes can influence pain and physical health. And this is some of the most remarkable research in terms of its practical implications for the real world, especially in today's world of increasing healthcare costs. So researchers in one study that was published in Science magazine looked at patients' recovery from surgery as a function of the view from their window during recovery. So this study was done at a hospital in which there were two wings, and one of the wings overlooked a parking lot, so asphalt, cars, etc. The other wing of the hospital overlooked nature. So you saw trees, you saw grass, you saw flowers. It overlooked a local park. They looked at patients who all had the same surgery. So the type of surgery did not have an effect. And when patients came into this hospital for the surgery, they were simply randomly assigned to, whichever wing, in fact, had space at the time. And what they found was that patients who were assigned to a wing that overlooked the park actually recovered from surgery faster. So they accomplished the surgical milestones, getting out of bed, eating, walking, etc., faster than patients whose rooms overlooked the parking lot. They also required less pain medication. The nurses rated them as doing better in terms of the recovery, and they were discharged faster. So recovery from surgery might be, in fact, in part driven by the situation that we're in and the impact of that on our physical health. Now, very recent research in the last year has tried to examine why that effect occurs. And what they did in this study was they had people in an MRI machine so they could look at brain activation. And they showed them one of two pictures. And I'm going to show you the actual two pictures that they used in this study. So these are the experimental measures. And what you can see here is that the pictures differ only in the sense of the scene that they're viewing. So the top picture is looking at an urban scene, and the bottom picture is looking at a nature scene. The pictures in this study were very carefully chosen to be similar in terms of interest level, in terms of color, complexity, etc. And what they did was they looked at brain activation patterns as people were looking at one of these two images. And what you saw is that people who were looking at the urban scene showed much higher levels of sort of brain activity and arousal, and that patients who were looking at participants who were looking at the nature scene showed much calmer brain waves. So it was much more relaxing. It was almost like they were meditating or doing yoga in terms of the response. So this study really suggests that looking at nature scenes may have an effect on our physiological well-being, in part by changing the level of our brain activity, and that in turn could lead to beneficial effects. Final thing I want to talk about in terms of pain and physical health is how positive mood can matter. And the positive mood clearly matters in terms of pain and physical health. A lot of this research has examined people who vary in terms of positive affect or optimism or sort of personality kind of measures, and has shown its strong influence on pain and physical health. So if you look at people who are dispositionally happy, so people who report overall higher levels of subjective well-being, they are better able to fight off colds. So in one study, this was done at the University of Pittsburgh by Cohen. He brought in healthy adult volunteers, and he had them complete measures of dispositional happiness, positive mood, and then he injected a cold virus into their nostril. So literally, a cold virus was injected into their nostril, again, following informed consent, et cetera, et cetera. And then the volunteers were quarantined for 4 weeks so that researchers could examine whether they manifested signs of the cold. And what they, in fact, found was that patients who were dispositionally happier were less likely to develop a cold, even though the cold virus had been directly inserted into their nostril. So they looked at measures of antibodies in blood. They took saliva samples. They had patients rate, how they were feeling, coughing, sneezing, sore throat, whatever. They also had patients save their used tissues, and they weighed the used tissues every night to measure mucus production. And across all of those different measures, people who were happy at the start of the study with their lives, with themselves, et cetera, were less likely to manifest signs of the cold. We also know that happy people recover faster from surgery. So I gave the example before of patients' recovery from surgery as a function of which wing of the hospital they looked at. In another study, they looked at patients who were all having the same surgery. they had them complete measures of positive mood before the surgery, and then they looked at surgical recovery. So how quickly did you walk? Did you eat? Did you get discharged? How much pain medication did you require, et cetera? People who are in a positive mood prior to the surgery show faster recovery across all of those different measures. Again, suggesting this link between our thoughts, our mood, our feelings, and our physical health. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, some research has suggested that people who are happier are generally in a better mood, live longer lives. So in one very clever study that was published in Psychological Science, researchers looked at baseball players, so Major League Baseball players, baseball cards, and in particular the facial expression that they were using in the cards. And then they examined, again through archival data, how long the baseball players lived as a function of the kind of mood or facial expression they were showing. And here's the data that people who have a neutral expression, as you can see, lived on average almost 73 years. People who had a slight smile in their baseball card lived on average about 75 years. And people who had a beaming smile on their baseball card lived close to 80 years. So you saw this dramatic difference in terms of longevity. This study was done specifically with baseball players, but other research has found identical findings with looking at high school yearbook pictures or other kinds of stimuli. Again, people's facial expression in a photo is positively correlated, as you might imagine, with their overall reports of happiness in life. And then finally, I want to talk about relationships. And relationships clearly influence physical health in a variety of ways, in some ways for better and in some ways for worse. So we know that friendships can influence our physical health, and that people who have tight contacts with other people, people who are have a strong social network, have strong social support systems, in fact, report higher levels of physical health. They recover from surgery faster. They have fewer reports of minor and major illnesses, and there's some evidence they, in fact, live longer. So having close relationships, could be romantic, could be friendships, but having close relationships seems to be protective in terms of physical health. This also may be correlated with what I described earlier in terms of positive mood. So it may be that people who are dispositionally happier, people who are in a positive mood more frequently, also may attract more friends, may have closer friendship relationships. And again, studies have been done similarly. I won't go into the details again, but in which a cold virus is inserted into people's nostrils, people who report stronger, more connected social networks before that introduction of the cold virus are less likely to manifest signs of the cold. Research has also examined social network data looking at patterns of both smoking and obesity in social networks. And what you see in this is that people who have friends who smoke, people who have friends who are obese, are at greater risk of being obese themselves. And in fact, this is true if you look at over time. So it's not the question that people who smoke or people who are obese find other people who are like them and develop those friendships. It's actually the case that if you look at over time, having such friends at one point in time increases your risk later on of both smoking and gaining weight. It's a little bit unclear exactly what the process might be here. So one factor might be that if you have a friend who smokes, of course, you are offered cigarettes more often, or you exposed to cigarettes more often, and may, in fact, develop your own interest in engaging in that behavior. It also may be that people who have friends who are overweight are more likely to eat with those friends or to eat more with those friends, or sort of see overweight as being more normative and therefore be less concerned about their own weight. But there's a clear contagion of smoking and obesity within social networks. On a more positive note, in terms of impacting health in a positive way, research has shown that there are clear benefits in terms of health of owning a dog. Now, people often ask, well, is it just a dog, or could it be a cat, or goldfish, or a hamster, or whatever? And the research has only suggested that having a dog is beneficial in terms of health. What I think is most interesting about this research is that it's not exactly clear what the mechanism is driving this effect. So if you look at research, elderly people, for example, with pets live longer, have fewer visits to the doctor, et cetera, than do elderly people who do not have a dog. But it's, again, not exactly clear what the mechanism is here. So one possibility is that people who have dogs typically have to walk the dogs. So it may be that really it's not the benefit of having a dog per se, it's the benefit of going outside every day and getting some exercise. And dogs are the only pets that are typically walked, so that might be sort of why we can see that unique benefit. There's also some thought that having a dog is sort of more social. So if you have a dog and you go outside and walk that dog, people might stop you and say, what's your dog's name, and how old is your dog, and oh, here's my dog, etc. So it may be, particularly for elderly people, that having a dog is really acting as sort of a conduit in terms of having social relationships that can be beneficial in a variety of ways. We also know that people's thoughts influence their feelings of attraction and love in their relationships, and this is true in both research settings and in real-world settings. So a classic study that my students always love, which I call the shaky bridge study, examined, and this is a very old sort of famous study in social psychology, but in this study it was done outside, and men were asked to complete a questionnaire. And when they'd finished the questionnaire, they were to walk across this bridge that was over, in fact, a giant ravine, and give the questionnaire to the female experimenter. So what varied in this study was the type of bridge you had to walk over. And men in one condition walked over a very sturdy bridge. So it was stable, there were high handrails, you walked across it, and again, it was just very easy to do, etc. In the other condition, men walked across a shaky bridge with low handrails that, and the bridge swayed as you walked, and so you had this feeling that while in fact you were participating in the study, you might plunge over to your death. So again, a very different sort of a response. And so the men came in, they completed the questionnaire, they walked across one of these two bridges to the female experimenter and handed the questionnaire to the female experimenter, and the female experimenter then said, thank you so much for participating. This was really helpful. And by the way, if you have any questions about this study, here's my phone number. And what the researchers ran was, who called? So when did men call? And what you found was that men who walked across the shaky bridge were much more likely to want to follow up with questions with a female experimenter, presumably because men who were in the shaky bridge walked across this bridge, felt sort of a pit in their stomach, and felt this muscular tension, this nausea in their stomach, their heart beating fast, breathing fast, etc. And again, that was because they thought they were potentially going to plunge to their death, but instead they look at the female experimenter and say, maybe it's because I really love you, and I'm really attracted to you. And so that's just again a research example, but we're going to talk later about how this plays out in daily life. Research has also examined a similar kind of idea, looking at couples who are in an amusement park and asking them to rate their level of attraction and arousal to their partner and their appearance of pictures of people both before and after they ride a major roller coaster, again, which leads to feelings of arousal, etc. And what you see is that people rate the attractiveness of other people as higher following doing the ride when you're feeling the adrenaline rush, etc., as opposed to before you're doing the ride. And then finally, we can see examples of this in the real world. So many of my students are interested in, the reality TV dating shows like The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, etc. And what you see in those shows is that people date each other, one man, one woman / 25 of potential dating partners. And what they've done on these studies, on these shows, is that before the participants participate, they in fact complete a measure that examines, psychological well-being. They want to make sure that, people aren't coming in and, are have some kind of psychological problems before they arrive. And what you see is that they have deliberately geared the dates on these shows to what is anxiety-provoking to people. And they've done that because they need to create for the audience this feeling of they're watching a couple fall in love. That's the sort of appeal and excitement of the show, which is what draws the ratings. So if somebody comes in and writes, I'm scared of heights, that person on their date is going to be doing something that is a major adrenaline rush. So in one recent season, somebody did in fact write they were scared of heights, and that person's first date was rappelling down a skyscraper with their potential mate. In another season, somebody wrote they were scared of sharks and being underwater, and their date was, in fact, a shark cage underneath the water with this, potential dating partner. So these are cases in which they're gearing the dates to create feelings of physiological arousal, and that leads people to then misattribute that arousal instead of thinking like, oh, I'm feeling anxious and aroused because I'm worried about the shark, or I'm worried about, falling off this building and dying. People, in fact, attribute it to the person that they are with. So they say, oh, I just, must love this person. I feel so attracted to this person whenever I'm there. My heart's beating fast, etc. And what they're not doing is taking into account, in fact, what's causing that arousal. We also see real-world examples of this. So following the 9/11 attacks, some of you might remember there were a number of cases reported in newspapers and magazines about women who had lost their firefighter, police officer husbands in the attacks, in fact, falling in love with married men who were their husbands' fellow firefighters. And so there were a few highly publicized cases in which men actually who had survived the attack left their spouses to marry one of the widows. And this is a case in which you can see the sort of complexity of what's going on, that here are men who have survived this attack, here are women who have lost their husbands in these attacks, and the people are feeling, intense emotion. They're feeling grief, they're feeling loss, they're feeling guilt, they're feeling sadness, depression, etc. And they're sharing those thoughts with somebody else who's really identifying and sharing it as well. And these are real and intense and powerful feelings. And what they're doing, in a sense, is transferring those feelings about the loss and interpreting them as love, as attraction, and in some cases, in fact, acting on that attraction by leaving their current spouse. And again, it's a way in which it's complicated to sort of know what the feelings we're feeling, what they really are, because feelings are rooted in similar feelings of arousal, whether they are feelings of grief or feelings of attraction or feelings of excitement or anxiety, etc. A few years ago, there was an interview with people who had survived that U.S. Airways plane crash into the Hudson, and two people who were interviewed on 60 Minutes or Dateline or something reported that they were pleased to announce that they had just gotten engaged and that this was very exciting, etc. And that's and the researcher, the interviewer said, oh, and how did you meet? And they said, oh, we met on the plane. Now you might think that means, oh, they met on the plane, sitting there having peanuts side by side, but no. When they say they met on the plane, they met on the wing of the plane. So this is a case where they're on this plane, they don't know each other. The pilot has assumed the crash position. There's the engines are going out. We're going to land in the water. People are terrified. They land in the water. They swim. Tread their way out of the plane. Water's coming in. It's cold. They narrowly escape the plane. They're treading water on the wing of the plane, etc. And gosh, here's somebody else that I'm looking at, and my heart's beating fast, and I'm feeling anxious and really aroused, etc. And boy, that could lead to a powerful feeling of attraction based on the situation that you're in. And you're looking at the person feeling this level of excitement, not recognizing that maybe it's largely caused by this, narrowly escaping death, and in fact thinking that it's this great attraction and arousal you have. So we can see many real-world examples of how thoughts can influence attraction and love. Here's a cartoon, I think, that illustrates this well. So, gee, but I missed the heightened eroticism of those 5.5 years of conjugal visits. So again, the idea that would be that the sense of doing something, in a prison setting would lead to similar feelings of arousal, again, because of the settings. And the final thing I want to talk about, and then we will have some time for questions, is how do our thoughts influence how we feel about our own partners? So this is, again, the people that we're actually dating with. Research has shown that there can be a tremendous downside to pornography because, in fact, people who are regularly exposed to, men who are regularly exposed to pornography judge their own, their current spouse, partner, etc., as less desirable. So again, that's sort of the contrast effect, that they're looking at their own, partner as less desirable compared to women who are airbrushed, surgically enhanced, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's, a real downside in terms of how the contrast can influence our own relationships. Research, and a lot of this work has been done by Sandra Murray at SUNY Buffalo. A lot of her research has shown that people who idealize their partners, so people who think about their partners as better than their partners even think about themselves, in fact, experience major benefits, so that people who see their partners in an idealized way report feeling happier in the relationship. And it also feels good, of course, to be the partner of somebody who sees you in such an idealized way, and that relationships in which you have this idealization tend to last longer and have higher levels of satisfaction. This is a picture of my kids, a little bit outdated. My kids are now 15, 13, and 10, but this was a few years ago. But research has shown that in happy relationships, people extend the same way that they think about themselves to their romantic partners, to their kids, etc. So most people, see their kids as, smarter, nicer, more attractive, etc. than they actually are. And that's, of course, how people who are psychologically healthy see themselves. So taking, your own biases in the way that you see yourself and extending those to your close family members, to your romantic partners, etc., seems to have benefits in a variety of ways. So I now want to end just briefly with conclusions, and these are the kinds of things that I say to students in my classes in terms of stuff they can, how they can take this information and use it in particularly concrete ways to help them in the real world. So one is, engage in mindful eating. So, set a nice place table, set the tablecloth, set the actual china. People are more mindful of what they're eating in those environments, are less likely to overeat. They eat more, carefully and more cautiously, and don't overeat in those settings. It's really important to be aware of false norms, and as I say to my female students, eat some chocolate, that there's often this perception that, other women, in fact, aren't hungry, are really thin, et cetera. And for college students and high school students, we know there's lots of danger of wanting to fit in, and if you believe that other women are thinner than they actually are, that can have negative consequences in terms of rates of eating disorders. So being aware that women probably self-present about eating. So they talk about how little they've eaten. They talk about how much they've exercised. They eat less in public, especially with a desirable dating partner. And those are all sort of false presentations of what women are actually doing to satisfy their own hunger, and that they actually may eat more than you think they eat. We also know that the cheap brand is just as effective, but you need to put it in the expensive bottle because, in fact, we are more convinced that things are beneficial when they're the name brand. So you can buy one bottle and then just fill it with a generic, but you need to believe that you're using something that's going to be more effective. I talked before about get a dog. This is a picture of my dog, Hobie, who is a mixed breed rescue dog, a hound dog. And research, in fact, shows that having a dog is beneficial in terms of physical well-being. Again, as I said earlier, it's not totally clear what's driving the effect, but regardless of what's driving the effect, it seems to be useful at both encouraging physical activity, exercise, walking, but also useful in terms of having social relationships and sort of making those kinds of connections. And then finally, in relationships, try to find ways to create physiological arousal. So we talked before about the real-world examples of this, and there are lots of different ways that people can create more arousal in their daily relationships. Art Aaron at SUNY Stony Brook has done a number of studies that have looked at the benefits for dating and married couples in long-term relationships of doing things that create physiological arousal. So whether that's doing, daring things with your partner like, bungee jumping or skydiving, neither of which I would ever do, but people could. But you also doing adventure travel. So going to exotic places, going to new places is good. Taking tango dancing lessons or something else. Again, lots of different ways that we can create physiological arousal in our own relationships, and that in fact leads to greater satisfaction in both short-term and long-term relationships. And then finally, idealize your loved ones. So there's, in fact, lots of evidence that seeing loved ones in an idealized way is beneficial. That helps people maintain relationships over time. And that's sort of the same way that we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but in happy relationships you see people engaging in that same sort of beneficial interpretation and idealization of the people they care about. So that's me. There's my email address, and there's my office phone. I don't think I can actually see questions that people are having, but I would be glad to answer questions if anybody has them. Maybe those could be read aloud since I can't see them, but I'd be glad to do that. And I would also be glad to send anybody a copy of this presentation via email if anybody shoots me an email, or if you have questions about the research I described that you want to use in your own teaching, I'd be glad to send you sites for any of those or papers for any of those, etc. So that's it. And thank you all for taking time out of your Friday at what I'm sure is a busy point of the semester for you all.
Yes, I would just like to reiterate what Dr. Sanderson has said, and if you have any questions, type them in the question box, and I will read them aloud to be answered.
Great.
Okay, we have one from Connie Belding. Sorry. What are your current research projects in this area?
Oh, that's a great question. So let's see. I'm looking at a number of different kinds of things. So I'll talk about a couple of them, but glad to follow up if people have questions. So one thing I'm really interested in doing is examining whether giving people information about this norm misperception in terms of the research I talked about women's weight, whether that in fact can have a beneficial effect. So a study that I did a few years ago with an honors thesis student at Amherst where I teach, we actually designed different intervention brochures that we randomly assigned women in the incoming freshman class to receive. And half of the brochures told women about this effect, like you think other women are really thin because women don't talk about how much they eat, but in fact you're wrong, and other women do gain weight just like you gain weight, etc. And we actually found that for some women, reading those brochures led to decreases later on in rates of disordered eating. That was a study that was published in the journal Health Psychology. So I'm interested now in sort of following up on what kind of awareness can we give students in terms of this false presentation, and does that in fact lead to better health if they're aware of this misperception. I'm also doing some similar research on that that's looking at a little bit of a different issue than the mind-body connection, but looking at the issue of stereotype threat, and in particular the common sort of belief in our society and on many college campuses is that athletes are not very bright, so sort of the dumb jock stereotype. And I've done some research looking at the power of that stereotype in terms of leading to underperformance in student athletes. And I'm interested now in sort of examining whether giving people information about that stereotype leads to improvements in terms of athlete performance academically. Great question. Thank you.
Great. And we have a couple more questions. This one's from Karen Hambright. Are there no reported benefits of cats with health?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. Thus far, there is not research showing benefits of any other animal other than dogs in terms of health. But again, I think that the challenge of that is that people have not, in many cases, have not been able to randomly assign people to get cats or not get cats. And I think that's in part because there are people who are allergic to cats. And so there has been some research that's done in which people, like in nursing homes or hospitals, et cetera, are randomly assigned to have like a therapy dog versus not. And so you can examine that data sort of more causally a little bit better than the data with cats. And I think the other issue is that people with cats don't have the advantage of walking them or of having the sort of social network association. So it's not saying that there isn't a benefit in terms of cat ownership. I actually have a cat and love the cat. And so I always sort of have that question myself. But there hasn't been strong enough research to definitively prove that. My theory is there probably are people who benefit from being cat owners, and we just need to kind of figure out what that personality kind of connection is. And perhaps there's actually like a personality dimension that predicts would you rather have a cat or rather have a dog, sort of an association, which would be a fascinating question to examine. So thanks for that. I agree with your intuition. Sorry.
No, fine. We have one more question, and it's from Peter Reiner. I am skeptical about the fMRI study of looking at nature pictures. Does that mean that photos of nature scenes are just as good as a window? And did that study just show different pictures?
Right. You know, that is a fascinating question, and I hope that you will shoot me an email because I'd like to send you the actual study, because the study was a little more complex than I described in terms of just this webinar in terms of the time. But what they actually did was they had a series of 3 studies, and that was one of their studies. Then they did a follow-up study in which they had people wearing one of those little like ERP caps So looking at brain activation, but in a way that you could walk around, unlike an MRI machine. And then they actually looked at brain activation as people were walking in either a park or more urban settings. They had a follow-up study which revealed very similar findings in terms of brain activation using the ERP instead, and they found very similar results. But I'd love to send you that paper if you could shoot me an email, since I can't see your email in this forum. And if you have thoughts about what it means or what it doesn't mean, I'd love to hear them and discuss them with you, because this research was published in the last, I'm going to say 6 months or so. It's very new research, and so I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around what it means and what it tells us. But great question, and like very, very cutting edge question. Thank you.
Okay, great. And if no one else has any more questions, I'm just going to wrap up here. And I will be sending out a follow-up email that will have a short webinar survey, and I would very much appreciate if you could all fill it out so we can improve our webinars going forward. And another note, we will have a recording of this webinar up on YouTube if you're interested in watching the session again. So please feel free to be in touch if you have any other questions. And once again, I just want to thank everyone for attending today and for sharing your good thoughts with us. And also a big thank you to Professor Sanderson for presenting.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Please be in touch with me if you'd like a copy of the presentation or have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.